So next we're going to talk about the division of the question. This is by far the most complicated of the voting procedures. And so I want to take it step by step. You've probably already studied this, but I just want to elaborate to make sure that we're all on the same page. And that is that we have to make a distinction between operative clauses and preambulatory or preambular clauses, right? The first part of a draft resolution includes the preambulatory clauses. These are the predicate for why the committee is proposing to take some action on whatever it's dealing with. It's kind of the, here's why we're taking action, sort of part of the resolution. Sort of whereas X is true, recognizing that Y is true, further recognizing that Z is true, we're going to be doing this, right? That's the idea. That's the preambulatory clause, the justification, the reason for why the committee is taking action. The action that's actually proposed is in the form of an operative clause. It's the actual proposal itself, not why the committee is doing something. An operative clause describes the actual proposal, what the committee is doing. Now, the reason this is relevant is the motion to divide the question only applies to operative clauses. You can only divide out an operative clause. Now, to explain the motion to divide the question, I'm going to use a metaphor, and I hope you'll bear with me. I want you to assume that the committee, instead of being a Model UN committee, you are a committee that is opening up a sandwich shop. Just bear with me here. And what you're doing is you're trying to decide what is going to be on the menu. Okay, that's what's going on here. So right now, the process that we're involved in is discussing whether to approve a particular sandwich that includes tomatoes. Now, go with me here. The draft resolution, right, that's your sandwich. The tomatoes, that's your operative clause. Okay, so I hope you got that. Okay, let me try this again. The draft resolution, that's your sandwich. The operative clause that we're talking about, those are your tomatoes. Okay, so here we go. Like I said, right now we're discussing whether to approve a sandwich with tomatoes on our menu for our new restaurant. Some delegates like the sandwich with tomatoes. Some don't like it with tomatoes. And so we're trying to decide what we're going to do. And as you'll see, eventually one of the things we're going to have to decide is whether or not to include tomatoes as a side dish. Okay, so here we are. And keep in mind, the sandwich is your draft resolution, the operative, the tomatoes. Okay, so you get to this part of the conference, and one of the delegates motions to divide the question, divide the tomatoes, right? So it would be thank you, Honorable Chair and fellow delegate. Cameron motions to divide operative X from draft resolution 1.1, right? In our metaphor, that's Cameron moves to take the tomatoes off of the sandwich, okay? That's what's going on here. By the way, in the background, my father-in-law is listening to this lecture and just cracking up, wondering what the hell I'm talking about. Okay, so in the actual conference, right, the operative would be something that your country can't support, that it finds objectionable. But that if it was removed, you could support the draft resolution and vote for it. Just like if the sandwiches were taken off the tomato, you could support the sandwich. Reverse that. If the tomatoes were taken off the sandwich, you could support the sandwich being on the menu, but not with the tomatoes. So now, unlike other motions, where the chair will just ask for a vote, in the division to divide the question, the chair will ask for 2 delegates to speak in favor of the motion, taking the tomatoes off, and 2 delegates to speak against taking them off. It's called 2 for, 2 against. So after 2 delegates get up and speak, two get in favor of it, two delegates get up and speak against it, there's going to be a vote. If the motion passes, then the tomatoes, or the operative, would be divided from the sandwich. The operative would be removed from the draft resolution, right? That's if the motion passes. Then the committee has to decide whether or not to support the operative, the tomatoes. The committee has to vote on whether to support the tomatoes on their own. In other words, if they vote to support the tomatoes on their own, kind of as a side dish on the menu, right? Then if that passes, then what would happen is the operative would pass, but it would be a standalone measure. It would be on its own. The operative would pass, everybody would do the golf clap, and that would be that. But you wouldn't be done at that point, because now you got a sandwich with no tomatoes on it. Then the committee would have to vote on whether to approve the sandwich without the tomatoes, right? Then, if that passes, then the sandwich without the tomatoes is also placed on the menu. Hopefully you're following this. My glasses suddenly appeared. So now I want you to go back up on the flow chart to where it says vote on operative X as a standalone measure, right? Before I already explained what happens if that motion passes. But what happens if that motion fails, right? If you look below where it says motion fails, as you see it says operative X fails as a separate measure. What that means in our metaphor is that the tomatoes as a side dish would not be included as a separate side dish. That operative would basically be tossed out. It'd be gone. But now you have to vote on draft resolution 1.1 without the tomatoes, right? So that's the way it would work. So the question, once the motion to divide the tomatoes is passed, tomatoes are gone, right? Now when you're voting, and it requires a 2/3 vote, the thing that you're voting on is basically whether or not to include or keep that operative as a standalone measure, as its own, basically its own draft resolution, its own paper, or whether it's going to be gotten rid of no matter what. But either way, you're going to wind up voting on the sandwich without the tomatoes. Okay, now we have to go back up to the top. Remember what I said, where it reads, vote on the motion to consider with 2 for and 2 against. This is the procedural vote. We already described what happens if it passes. Well, what happens if that fails? People make an argument for removing the tomatoes. People make an argument against removing the tomatoes, right? And that motion fails. So that somebody tried to divide the tomatoes out. It didn't work, right? What happens now? Well, now you're going to vote on draft resolution 1.1 with the tomatoes. You're going to vote on the draft resolution with the operative already in it. So hopefully that you followed that. And if not, try playing this over one more time, and hopefully it will make a little bit more sense.